Daniel Okoye had the kind of confidence that didn't walk into a room, it occupied it. Not loud, not clownish, not the type that begged for attention like a generator begging for fuel, but the polished, smooth confidence of a man who believed life was a ladder, and he had already found the hidden shortcut to the top. At 36, Daniel was a senior operations manager at Adeyemi Logistics, one of the fastest rising shipping and haulage companies in Lagos. His suits were always crisp, his wristwatch always shining, his shoes always clean enough to reflect your future, if your future was bright enough to stand near him. In the office, people respected him the way they respected traffic officers, not necessarily out of love, but because it was safer to just comply. Daniel spoke with certainty even when he was wrong, and the scary thing was, half the time, the world adjusted itself just to prove him right. He liked being seen as the dependable one, the man who could fix messy schedules, smooth angry clients, and turn chaotic operations into neat reports. He liked praise, but he preferred fearful respect, the kind that made people laugh at his jokes even when the joke was clearly not funny. And in his mind, his biggest achievement wasn't his salary or his office space or even the recognition from executives. It was the fact that he had constructed a life where nobody questioned him. A life where he could be admired at work, respected in public, and still be the center of his own private universe. If arrogance was perfume, Daniel wore it lightly, just enough for everyone to inhale it without realizing it was choking him. At home, Daniel performed marriage the way an actor performs a role he has memorized, confidently, predictably, and with a smile that came out at the right time like a well-trained security dog. Miriam Okoye, his wife of 8 years, was the opposite of drama. Quiet, patient, soft-spoken. The kind of woman who could be in the room and still make you forget she was there, until you needed something done, and somehow she had already done it. Her beauty was not the type that screamed, "Look at me." It was the type that sat calmly and let you discover it slowly. Warm brown skin, gentle eyes that seemed to look at people without trying to win them, and a graceful way of moving that made the whole house feel less chaotic just because she was inside it. She worked as a procurement officer for a small firm and had the kind of steady income that didn't impress loud people, but kept the fridge full and the bills paid. Daniel used to say he married Miriam because she was peace. But the truth was, he married her because peace is easy to control. Miriam rarely raised her voice. She didn't like public arguments. She didn't fight for the last word. She didn't interrogate him about late nights or suspicious calls. In Daniel's mind, that made her a perfect wife, like a silent fan that cools you without asking for thanks. Sometimes, when Miriam smiled at him across the dining table, Daniel felt a strange, brief stab of guilt. But guilt, to Daniel, was like an annoying notification. He swiped it away and continued his day. He convinced himself he deserved enjoyment. He worked hard, didn't he? He provided, didn't he? So if he wanted extra sweetness outside, wasn't that just life rewarding him? He didn't know that this way of thinking wasn't wisdom. It was the beginning of his downfall, wearing a friendly face. The first time Evelyn Adeyemi entered Daniel's world, it didn't feel like trouble. It felt like an upgrade. She appeared at a quarterly corporate dinner that Adeyemi Logistics held in a high-end restaurant overlooking the Lagos skyline, the kind of place where the chairs were so soft you could forget your sins for a few minutes. Daniel had arrived early, greeting colleagues with his usual smooth confidence, already calculating who to impress and who to ignore. Then she walked in, Evelyn, the boss's wife, dressed in elegance that didn't beg for attention, but still collected it like debt. She had the posture of a woman who was used to being watched, and the face of someone who could smile politely while thinking 10 steps ahead. When she greeted Daniel, her handshake was firm, her eyes steady, and her voice gentle in a way that made you lean closer without realizing you were moving. "Daniel, I've heard you're the reason this company doesn't collapse whenever my husband travels," she said, smiling like it was a compliment. Daniel chuckled, proud, and responded with the kind of humility that was actually disguised pride. They spoke briefly, just enough for Daniel to feel noticed by power. But even that short conversation planted something dangerous, the idea that he mattered to a world above his own. As the dinner continued, Daniel watched Evelyn from a distance. He noticed how she occasionally stared at her phone, as if waiting for a message that never came. He noticed how she laughed at jokes half a second late, like her mind was elsewhere. And he noticed how, when her husband's name was mentioned, she smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. Daniel did not yet call it loneliness. He did not yet call it opportunity. He simply felt the first flicker of curiosity, and because he had lived too long believing he was untouchable, he didn't recognize it for what it truly was. The first tiny spark before a whole house catches fire. Evelyn Adeyemi's life looked like the kind of life people prayed for in loud churches and whispered about in quiet salons. She lived in a gated estate where even the streetlights looked expensive, drove a car that never struggled in traffic like common people, and wore perfume that arrived before she did. To outsiders, she was Madam, the boss's wife, an image of grace, class, and soft power. But behind the clean glass and polished tiles was a marriage that felt like a beautifully framed photo with nothing behind it. Her husband, Mr. Adeyemi, was respected and feared in the business space, yet emotionally absent in the home space. He provided everything that could be bought, but affection wasn't on his invoice. Evelyn had learned how to smile through loneliness like it was part of her skincare routine. She didn't complain publicly. She didn't embarrass her husband. She simply carried silence the way some women carried handbags, everywhere, every day, without anyone asking what was inside. On the surface, Evelyn's marriage looked unbreakable, but it was actually built on schedule, reputation, and strategy. Mr. Adeyemi treated the company like a kingdom and treated marriage like a contract that should not be breached, not because he was romantic, but because he was proud. In his world, people didn't lose control, and wives didn't misbehave. Evelyn had tried in the beginning to earn softness from him, small surprises, warm dinners, gentle talks at night. But each attempt met the same wall. I'm tired. We'll talk later. You don't understand pressure. After a while, she stopped asking. She stopped expecting. The loneliness didn't disappear. It simply changed shape into something sharper, something that needed an outlet. She began attending more company events, not for fun, but for distraction. And in those spaces, she noticed the men who leaned in when she spoke, the ones who made her feel seen again. Not loved, just seen. Daniel was one of them. Unlike others who looked at her like a trophy, Daniel looked at her like a person. That was what made him dangerous. That was what made him easy. Daniel, on his part, did not go home that night thinking, I want to ruin my boss's marriage. He went home thinking, that woman is powerful. And power attracted him the way light attracted moths, quietly, irresistibly, foolishly. He kept replaying her compliment in his mind like a voice note he couldn't delete. Miriam served him dinner, asked how work was, and Daniel answered smoothly, as always. Yet his eyes drifted to his phone more than usual, not because he had a message, because he was imagining one. In bed, Miriam's breathing was calm beside him, and Daniel stared at the ceiling, wearing his arrogance like armor. Even if anything ever happened, who would suspect me? He didn't understand that pride is not protection. It is the loudest invitation for trouble. The first message from Evelyn came 3 days later, and it wasn't romantic. That was the trick. It was simple, safe, professional looking, just enough to be harmless if anyone ever saw it. Daniel, I'm trying to surprise my husband with something small. What's his schedule like next week? Daniel stared at the text for a full minute, smiling like someone had called his name in a crowded room. He replied with the efficiency of an employee and the excitement of a man who suddenly felt important. One message became two. Two became a short call. Then the calls began to last longer than they needed to. Daniel told himself he was just being helpful. Evelyn told herself she was just being friendly. Both of them were lying in ways that felt polite. Their conversations slowly stopped being about schedules and started being about feelings, delivered carefully, like contraband wrapped in clean paper. Evelyn spoke about loneliness with a casual laugh, the kind of laugh that said, I'm fine, while the words underneath screamed, I'm not. Daniel responded with empathy that made him feel like a hero. He found himself saying things he had not said to Miriam in months. You deserve better. That must be hard. You're stronger than people know. Evelyn listened, as if his words were water. Daniel didn't notice he was feeding something, because he liked the way it fed his ego too. The more Evelyn leaned on him, the taller he felt. He began volunteering information, offering help without being asked. At work, he started timing his movements, so he could run into her around the office when she visited. They never behaved improperly in public, but their eyes did too much talking. A look held too long. A smile that stayed after the conversation ended. Small things that meant nothing to outsiders, yet meant everything to people who were already halfway lost. Miriam noticed a change that she couldn't name but could feel. Daniel began coming home with energy that wasn't hers. He talked more, but the words felt rehearsed, like he was performing innocence rather than living it. He started taking phone calls outside. He became unusually protective of his screen. Miriam didn't confront him. She simply watched him the way you watch a pot that has started to tremble before boiling over. One evening, while Daniel was in the bathroom, his phone buzzed on the couch. Miriam didn't pick it up. She didn't snoop. She only looked at the screen from a distance and saw a name flash, Evelyn A. She felt a quiet pinch in her chest, small, sharp, controlled. Daniel came out smiling, reached for his phone like it was a newborn child, and said, "Just work." Miriam nodded and returned to her book. Daniel mistook her calm for ignorance. Miriam's calm was not ignorance. It was the beginning of careful thinking. The first close call arrived like rain, without thunder, sudden, quiet, and dangerous. Daniel had adjusted a set of internal schedules to accommodate a special visitor movement Evelyn had requested. He justified it easily. It was minor, it wouldn't affect operations, and it made him look helpful. The next day, Mr. Adeyemi returned from a trip earlier than expected. No announcement. No warning. The kind of return that reminded everyone that power didn't need permission to show up. The office shifted instantly. Voices dropped. Backs straightened. People suddenly remembered how busy they were. Daniel felt his stomach tighten the moment he saw his boss step out of the elevator, looking refreshed and sharp like a man who had slept properly while others struggled. Later that afternoon, Mr. Adeyemi called Daniel into his office. Not the usual quick update meeting, the kind where the door closed softly behind you, and the air felt heavier. Adeyemi flipped through a folder, tapped a page with his pen, and asked in a calm voice, "Why was this schedule altered?" Daniel's heart jumped, but his face stayed smooth. Years of corporate survival had trained him. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford. Daniel leaned forward, looked at the page as if he was seeing it for the first time, and spoke with confident ease. "Sir, that change was to prevent a delay with one of the priority deliveries. I can revert it if you want, but it saved us a bottleneck." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Adeyemi stared at him for a long moment, reading not the words, but the man behind them. Then he nodded once. "Be careful with adjustments," he said. "Small things become big problems." Daniel smiled and promised professionalism. When Daniel left the office, his legs felt slightly weak, not from fear of being caught cheating, fear of being seen as reckless. His pride had been touched, and pride, once touched, becomes stubborn. That night, Daniel texted Evelyn, warning her that things were sensitive. Evelyn replied quickly, almost too quickly, "Relax. You handled it. You're smart." Those words calmed him more than they should have. Miriam watched Daniel eat dinner with unusual silence, his eyes drifting to his phone, his jaw occasionally tightening like he was replaying something painful. Miriam asked softly, "You're quiet today. Everything okay?" Daniel forced a smile. "Just work pressure," he said, the classic lie men used like deodorant. Spray it and hope nobody smells the truth. Miriam nodded and didn't press. But when Daniel went to sleep, Miriam stayed awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling the way women do when their minds are beginning to build a plan they have not yet named. Evelyn began tightening the rope slowly, so slowly Daniel didn't recognize it as a rope. She called him during office hours, not privately now, but as if she had every right to. She asked for small favors that sounded reasonable, approve a vendor quickly, push a document forward, sign off on a payment that was urgent. Each request came wrapped in charm and gratitude. Daniel felt special. chosen. In his mind, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was simply being efficient. And even when a tiny voice inside him whispered, "Why is the boss's wife involving you in this?" he silenced it with the same arrogance that had protected him all his life. "I know what I'm doing." Then came the moment Evelyn pushed him past comfort. She met him briefly in the parking area, public enough to look innocent, private enough to feel intimate. She didn't touch him. She didn't flirt openly. She only spoke in a soft, urgent tone. "Daniel, I need you to approve one payment. It's for a vendor my husband already agreed on. But you know how he is. He delays things when he's busy. If this doesn't move now, it will cause embarrassment." Daniel hesitated. Evelyn's eyes held his. "Please," she added quieter. "Just help me once." That sentence landed like a hook. Not because it was romantic, but because it made Daniel feel responsible for her peace. He nodded. "Send it," he said. Evelyn exhaled as if he had saved her life. Daniel walked away, feeling both powerful and uneasy. He had crossed a line, not as a lover, but as a professional. And professional lines, once crossed, leave footprints you can't scrub away. At home, Miriam noticed the shift again. Daniel became unusually irritated when asked simple questions. He started reacting to small things as if they were attacks. Miriam asked, "Will you be around this weekend?" Daniel snapped, "Why are you monitoring me?" Miriam blinked, surprised not by the anger, but by how quickly it rose. She apologized softly, and Daniel immediately softened, guilt flashing across his face for half a second. He bought her small gifts the next day, random, unnecessary, like a man trying to cover a smell with perfume. Miriam thanked him, smiling politely, but she was watching. She also began noticing a pattern. Whenever Daniel came home tense, he checked his phone like someone waiting for rescue. One evening, as Daniel stepped into the balcony to take a call, Miriam walked toward the kitchen and caught fragments of his voice through the sliding door, low, urgent, pleading in a way she had never heard from him. "I said I'll do it." "Yes, I know. Just calm down." Miriam paused. Her hand rested on the counter. She didn't move closer. She didn't eavesdrop fully. She only listened long enough to confirm what her instincts had already begun to whisper. Daniel was not just hiding a relationship. He was hiding pressure. When he ended the call and returned inside, Miriam looked at him and asked gently, "Everything all right?" Daniel smiled too quickly. "Yes," he said. "Nothing." Miriam nodded, but inside her mind, something clicked into place. Whatever Daniel was doing, it was starting to control him. And if it was controlling him, it could destroy him. Miriam didn't know yet whether she would save him or expose him. But she knew one thing for sure. She would not remain blind. Miriam did not wake up one morning suddenly transformed into a detective or a strategist. Her shift was quieter than that, almost unnoticeable. She simply stopped asking questions that would earn her lies and started paying attention to the answers Daniel gave freely. She noticed how his moods rose and fell with his phone notifications, how certain evenings made him restless, how he sometimes rehearsed sentences before speaking, as though preparing a defense for a crime nobody had accused him of yet. Silence, Miriam realized, had an advantage. It made people reveal themselves. And Daniel, thinking he was safe, was revealing everything. At work, Daniel felt the pressure tightening in subtle ways. Evelyn's requests became more frequent, though never aggressive. She always sounded calm, grateful, even affectionate, as if he were doing her a personal favor rather than bending professional rules. Daniel told himself he was still in control, but control now required effort. He found himself checking policy manuals late at night, not to follow them, but to reassure himself he hadn't crossed too far. His confidence began to feel strained, like a shirt button holding on for dear life. He started snapping at junior staff, correcting mistakes too sharply, asserting authority where it wasn't necessary. Fear disguised as leadership. One evening, Miriam served dinner quietly and mentioned, casually, that an old university friend had reached out to her after years of silence. She spoke lightly, as if it meant nothing. Daniel barely listened, distracted by his phone. What he didn't know was that this friend worked in corporate compliance and audit risk. Miriam had not asked for help. She had only asked questions that sounded innocent. And with each answer, her understanding deepened, not just of Daniel's affair, but of a dangerous territory he was unknowingly entering. The affair no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a responsibility Daniel hadn't agreed to, but couldn't refuse. When he met Evelyn now, the conversations carried urgency beneath the warmth. She still smiled, still praised him, but her expectations were clearer. Daniel noticed how carefully she chose her words, how she reminded him, gently, of how much she trusted him. Trust, when weaponized, became obligation. And Daniel, who had always prided himself on being dependable, found himself saying yes even when his instincts screamed no. Evelyn sensed his hesitation and adjusted her approach. She spoke less about herself and more about us, about how much she relied on him, how exposed she felt without his support. She didn't threaten. She didn't demand. She simply leaned, confident he would carry the weight. Daniel began waking up with tension in his chest, his mind racing before his feet touched the floor. The excitement that once came with secrecy had disappeared, replaced by a gnawing fear that something was slipping beyond his control. Yet, perversely, that fear kept him tied to her. He was already too deep to walk away cleanly, or so he believed. Miriam noticed Daniel's restlessness more clearly now. He paced the house like a man expecting bad news. He laughed less. When she touched his arm absent-mindedly, he flinched, not from guilt, but from distraction. Miriam did not react. Instead, she began arranging her thoughts carefully, like files being placed into folders. She wasn't angry yet. Anger required certainty. What she felt was preparation. Daniel had signed documents thousands of times in his career. Signatures were muscle memory to him, automatic, routine, almost thoughtless. That was what made this one dangerous. The file Evelyn sent him looked ordinary enough. Vendor payments, internal transfers, standard approvals. He skimmed, reassured himself that nothing looked outrageous, and signed. It wasn't the first time he had trusted her judgment, and he convinced himself it wouldn't be the last. He didn't notice the small irregularities hiding in plain sight, the kind that only mattered once someone started looking closely. Days later, Daniel overheard a tense exchange between two finance officers discussing delays and missing confirmations. The words didn't fully register at first, but they lingered in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. He pulled up the documents he had approved and read them more carefully this time. His stomach tightened. Not enough to panic, but enough to worry. He considered calling Evelyn, then stopped. Asking questions now would make him look uncertain. And uncertainty, in Daniel's mind, was weakness. At home, Miriam mentioned, again casually, that her compliance friend had been talking about how many scandals began with small, trusted approvals. Daniel laughed nervously, assuming it was coincidence. Miriam watched his reaction closely, noting how quickly his smile faded. She said nothing more. In her silence, Daniel heard nothing. But silence, Miriam knew, could scream. Miriam decided to do something that confused Daniel completely. She became warmer. She laughed more easily, asked about his day with genuine softness, even cooked his favorite meals without being asked. Daniel felt a strange relief, interpreting her kindness as proof that everything was fine. He relaxed his guard at home, unaware that comfort was exactly what made people careless. Miriam wasn't pretending affection. She was choosing timing. Meanwhile, Daniel leaned further into Evelyn's world, believing that if he could just keep things steady, the tension would pass. He reassured her that everything was under control, even as his own confidence thinned. Evelyn listened with the calm of someone who knew more than she was saying. Her trust in him felt unshakable, and that, somehow, frightened him more than suspicion would have. Miriam's conversations with her compliance friend deepened, though they still sounded casual to anyone listening. She asked about audit triggers, about internal controls, about how long things stayed hidden before surfacing. Each answer sharpened her understanding. She wasn't building a case yet. She was building clarity. And clarity, once complete, could not be undone. The corporate networking event Daniel had discouraged Miriam from attending became a turning point he never saw coming. Miriam arrived quietly, dressed simply, blending easily into the background. Daniel spotted her across the room and felt a flash of irritation, not because she didn't belong, but because her presence disrupted his sense of control. Evelyn noticed too. Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between the two women. Miriam watched Evelyn carefully, not with jealousy, but with interest. She noticed how people deferred to her, how conversations shifted when she spoke, how confident she looked in spaces she didn't technically own. Miriam also noticed something else. Evelyn was not nervous. Not even slightly. That kind of calm did not belong to someone hiding a harmless secret. It belonged to someone who believed she was protected. Daniel spent the rest of the evening unsettled. Miriam was polite, distant, observant. She did not confront Evelyn. She did not question Daniel. She simply saw enough to confirm what she had already suspected. This was no careless affair. This was a system. And systems, once exposed, collapsed loudly, even if the people inside them fell quietly. Daniel did not go looking for the truth. The truth stumbled into him while he was trying to save himself. Late one evening at the office, long after most staff had left, he stayed back to recheck a set of approvals he suddenly couldn't stop thinking about. What began as a simple review turned unsettling when he noticed a pattern. Transactions routed through departments he rarely worked with, approvals duplicated under different project names, and timelines that overlapped in ways that made no operational sense. His heart thudded harder as he realized these were not isolated errors. They were structured, intentional. Someone had designed them carefully. What truly shook him came when he opened an internal email chain he had been copied on but never read closely. Buried beneath polite corporate language was a quiet plan, one that positioned Daniel as the approving authority on every questionable transaction. His name, his access, his signature. Evelyn had made sure of it. And then he saw it, a side correspondence suggesting, Daniel will take responsibility if questions arise. The words felt like ice water poured down his spine. For the first time, Daniel understood the affair for what it truly was, not intimacy, not connection, but insurance. He had not been chosen because he was special. He had been chosen because he was convenient. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his confidence cracking under the weight of realization. Every reassuring smile Evelyn had given him replayed in his mind, now stripped of warmth. He thought of Miriam, quiet, observant Miriam, and felt something dangerously close to fear. He had believed himself untouchable. But now, sitting alone in the office with fluorescent lights humming like witnesses, Daniel realized he was standing at the center of a mess he did not control and did not fully understand. The announcement of an external audit arrived without ceremony. A simple company-wide email. Polite wording. Severe implications. Daniel read it twice, then a third time, hoping the words would change. They didn't. His first instinct was to call Evelyn. She didn't answer. He sent a message, carefully worded, calm on the surface, urgent underneath. No reply. Hours passed. Silence settled in, heavy and deliberate. At work, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Conversations dropped when Daniel walked past. Files were requested. Meetings were scheduled without explanation. The protection he had felt, imaginary as it now seemed, evaporated. Evelyn, once so present, became unreachable. Daniel's mind raced through every interaction, every favor, every signed document. He began to understand that the calm confidence Evelyn had carried was not courage. It was preparation. She had always known this moment would come. At home, Miriam noticed Daniel's panic long before he spoke. He paced, spoke in fragments, reacted sharply to small questions. She did not press him. Instead, she observed with a steady calm that unsettled him more than accusations would have. When Daniel finally muttered, "There's an audit," Miriam simply nodded. "Audits come," she said softly. Daniel stared at her, suddenly unsure whether her words were comfort or warning. Daniel's first formal meeting with the auditors was polite, professional, and terrifying. They didn't accuse him outright. They didn't need to. They asked questions that circled carefully, like hunters studying prey. He answered confidently at first, relying on habit and status. But as documents were placed in front of him, documents he recognized too well, his composure thinned. The auditors spoke calmly about cooperation, about transparency, about how early honesty often reduced personal impact. Daniel heard the unspoken message clearly. This can go very badly for you. What made the choice unbearable was what cooperation truly meant. If Daniel spoke fully, Evelyn would fall, and with her, his affair would be exposed, his marriage publicly humiliated, his carefully built image dismantled. If he stayed silent, the blame would drift toward lower-level employees who had followed instructions without question. Innocent people would suffer because of decisions he had made to protect himself and please a woman who had never intended to protect him. For the first time in his life, Daniel was cornered not by power, but by conscience. He went home that night hollowed out, carrying the weight of a decision he could no longer postpone. Miriam listened as he spoke vaguely about pressure and mistakes. She didn't ask who. She didn't ask how. Her silence forced him to hear his own thoughts more clearly than any lecture could. Daniel realized something deeply unsettling then. No matter what he chose, the life he knew was already over. Daniel finally tried to confess, but not fully. He sat across from Miriam at the dining table, his voice low, careful, incomplete. He spoke about work complications, about trusting the wrong people, about being pulled into things he didn't fully understand. He avoided names. He avoided details. He avoided the truth. Miriam listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, he waited for reassurance, anger, tears, anything. What he received was silence. That silence was not passive. It was deliberate. Miriam stood up calmly, cleared the table, and said, "You should rest." No accusations. No comfort. Daniel felt exposed in a way he had never experienced. Her refusal to rescue him forced him to confront the possibility that she already knew far more than he had admitted. That night, Daniel barely slept. The house felt unfamiliar, like he was a guest in a place where he no longer belonged. Miriam lay awake too, though her thoughts were steady, not chaotic. She had reached the point she had been quietly approaching for weeks, clarity. She no longer wondered if Daniel was involved. She understood how. And more importantly, she understood why. The silence she maintained now was not uncertainty. It was control. The boardroom felt different the morning the discrepancies were presented. The usual warmth of professional courtesy was gone, replaced by formality sharp enough to cut. Charts appeared on the screen. Numbers were explained. Patterns were highlighted. Daniel's name surfaced repeatedly, not as an accusation, but as a fact. Each mention tightened the air. Mr. Adeyemi sat rigidly, his face unreadable, disappointment radiating more loudly than anger ever could. As questions intensified, Evelyn's absence became impossible to ignore. Her chair remained empty. No excuses were offered on her behalf. Daniel realized then that she had already moved ahead of him, emotionally, strategically, legally. The affair that had once fed his ego now stood like evidence against him. Every choice he had made to feel important had stripped him of importance in the only room that mattered. When Daniel left the meeting, he felt smaller than he ever had. The confidence that once carried him had collapsed into something fragile and unfamiliar. Outside the boardroom he paused, steadying himself against the wall, understanding finally that karma did not arrive loudly. It arrived quietly, through exposure, through silence, through the slow removal of illusions he had mistaken for power. Miriam did not announce herself when she finally stepped into the process that had been unfolding around Daniel. There was no dramatic entrance, no raised voice, no emotional display that could be dismissed as bitterness. She arrived calmly, formally invited as a witness after her earlier conversations with compliance had raised silent flags. Daniel did not know this yet. He was already seated when she entered the room, his body stiffening not out of guilt, but confusion. Miriam looked composed, almost distant, like someone who had already crossed an emotional bridge he was still standing before. She spoke clearly when asked, answering questions with precision rather than emotion. She did not insult Daniel. She did not beg for sympathy. She simply confirmed facts, timelines, behavioral changes, connections that aligned too neatly to ignore. When the affair was mentioned, she did not flinch. She confirmed it the way one confirms a date or an address. The room absorbed her calm like a shockwave. Daniel realized, too late, that her silence had never been weakness. It had been preparation. As Miriam finished, Daniel felt something inside him finally collapse. Not his reputation, that had already begun to crumble, but the illusion that his wife had been behind him, dependent on him, blind because she loved him. She had seen everything. She had simply chosen the moment to speak. And in that moment, Daniel understood the cruelest truth of all. The woman he underestimated had become the most powerful voice in the room. Evelyn Adeyemi's disappearance ended abruptly. She was stopped before she could leave the country, her confidence dissolving under the weight of evidence she had believed would never surface. When her name was formally attached to the web of transactions, the calm she had worn like armor shattered. The woman who once moved through corporate spaces with unshakable poise now faced questions that stripped away charm and influence alike. Power, she learned too late, could not negotiate with documented truth. As details emerged, it became clear that Evelyn had orchestrated the system carefully, layering approvals, redirecting responsibility, and positioning Daniel as both shield and scapegoat. The affair had been leverage. Her trust had been strategy. Each calculated move revealed a level of foresight Daniel had never imagined. The board watched in stunned silence as the full scope of her manipulation came into view, and the admiration she once commanded curdled into disbelief. Daniel watched her fall without satisfaction. There was no relief in seeing her exposed, no pleasure in her unraveling. Only the hollow realization that he had sacrificed everything, his integrity, his marriage, his future, for a role he had never fully understood. Evelyn had believed herself untouchable because of proximity to power. Daniel had believed himself clever because of access. Both were wrong. Only one would walk away in handcuffs, but neither escaped unscathed. Daniel avoided prison, but the escape did not feel like mercy. Cooperation spared him legal punishment, yet stripped him of everything else. His position was terminated quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Years of work reduced to a single meeting and a sealed envelope. His name, once associated with reliability, became shorthand for failure in corridors he was no longer welcome to walk through. Friends stopped calling. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Respect evaporated faster than it had been earned. The days that followed blurred into something shapeless and heavy. Daniel woke up with nowhere to go, no authority to wield, no illusion to maintain. The house felt unfamiliar now, not because it had changed, but because he had. He moved through rooms like a visitor, conscious of his presence in ways he never had been before. Every silence echoed louder than any confrontation could have. What hurt most was not the loss of status, but the clarity that followed it. Daniel finally understood how casually he had gambled with everything that mattered, mistaking control for intelligence and secrecy for safety. There were no speeches left to give himself, no excuses that still sounded convincing. For the first time in his life, Daniel faced consequences that could not be negotiated away. Miriam chose her moment carefully, not because she needed courage, but because she valued closure. She told Daniel she was leaving on an ordinary afternoon, her voice steady, her posture relaxed. There were no packed bags displayed for effect, no tears offered as proof of pain. She spoke simply, explaining that she no longer trusted the space they shared, and without trust, there was nothing left to protect. Daniel listened in stunned silence, his rehearsed apologies dissolving before they reached his lips. He tried to plead, but his words lacked urgency. They sounded like echoes of conversations that should have happened long ago. Miriam did not argue. She did not list his failures. She did not insult Evelyn or remind him of humiliation. She only said, "I see you clearly now." And clarity, once reached, did not reverse itself. Daniel realized then that forgiveness was no longer the issue. Understanding had replaced hope. When Miriam walked away, she did so without spectacle. No doors were slammed. No neighbors were alerted. She left behind a man who had lost his audience and his purpose in the same season. Daniel sat alone long after she was gone, finally understanding that endings did not always arrive with noise. Some arrived with calm finality. Daniel watched the news coverage alone, seated in a quiet room that once felt like proof of success. The scandal replayed with clinical distance, names mentioned, timelines summarized, outcomes concluded. Evelyn's fall was analyzed. The company's recovery was discussed. Daniel's role was referenced briefly, almost dismissively, as if he were a footnote in a larger story. He realized then how small he had become in a narrative he once believed he controlled. Miriam moved forward quietly, rebuilding without spectacle, choosing peace over victory. There were no public celebrations of freedom, no dramatic declarations of independence. Just distance. Just dignity. Daniel thought of all the moments he had mistaken silence for weakness, calm for ignorance, love for permission. The irony settled deep in his chest, heavy and undeniable. Karma had not arrived screaming. It had not knocked. It had walked in gently, disguised as truth, patience, and consequence. And by the time Daniel recognized it, there was nothing left to bargain with. Only the quiet understanding that the woman he underestimated had survived, and the man who believed he was untouchable had been proven painfully wrong. Please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.